Okay, well, thank you very much. Let's see, the first thing I'd like to do is I praise Jesus Christ as my Savior. I also thank Juliet Ayuk for inviting me and Leslie for helping me struggle through getting this presentation going. And I'd also like to mention our co-sponsor is the IEEE Oceanic Engineering Society, of which I'm a speaker, so a distinguished speaker. So let me get the presentation. So the IEEE OES is involved in many different facets of ocean engineering. And notice it's ocean engineering, so it can be anything as complex as underwater vehicles, as well as testing strength of cables, as well as wind power, as you see in the lower part of the screen. The thing about the ocean is it's complex. It's probably the most complex, in my opinion, medium that you can work on, especially for a signal processor. As you can see, it's affected by weather, tides. It can be affected by underwater, events like earthquakes, etc. And there are many different facets to it. Marine biology, of which Juliet is an expert in, especially towards dolphins and whales, chemistry, etc. So it's a great medium to work in because the problems are really difficult and they're fun. IEEE OES is involved in many different aspects of ocean engineering. As I said, with AUVs, sonar arrays, tracking, marine biology, marine mammals, etc. So the OES, if you're interested in the ocean, and I assume you are, that this is really a good society to get involved with because they cut across the entire spectrum, but they are focused on the ocean. From a signal processor's perspective, keep in mind that many of the signal processing algorithms that evolved, such as array signal processing, beamform, first came out of the IEEE OES journals, with some notable people like Harry Cox, Art Bagarar, et cetera, developing these techniques. So signal processing has always been an integral part of the IEEE Oceanic Engineering Society. So take a look on the website, and a lot of the things that I'm talking about today will be available for download either through University of New Orleans or at the website itself. Okay, so my talk, finally, get down to business here. My talk, I'll give you an introduction to the Bayesian approach. I'll talk about sequential Bayesian processors, particle filters in the state space, and then show you an ocean acoustic application, of which I appended the actual paper that appeared in the Journal of the Acoustical Society of America. So Bayesian model-based signal processing, what is that? It's a mouthful. Okay, first of all, we do statistical signal processing. It's simply the processing of uncertain or noisy random data. Bayesian signal processing is focused on the estimation of the underlying probability distribution of a random signal in order to perform statistical inferences and extract informational statistics, things like conditional means, maximum a posteriori estimates. Once you've got the posterior distribution, which I'll define shortly, then you've got it all. And from that, you can extract the statistics. When the underlying processes are nonlinear and the noise is non-gaussian, then a Bayesian approach enables a potential solution to this problem. For many years, I worked in Kalman filtering linear, nonlinear, linearized, et cetera, but they're always unimodal with Gaussian assumptions. I was very excited back in 2005 when I did a sabbatical at the University of Cambridge, and Simon Gottsel and his crew of students and professors taught me a lot about the Bayesian approach to doing this. So thank you, Simon. The incorporation of sophisticated models into the process also enables the extraction of the desired information. So if you have a model of the physics, you can put it in into the Bayesian processor, as well as what you could do if you did Kalman filtering. So Bayesian model-based signal processing is primarily concerned with the estimation of the posterior distribution governing the problem, incorporating physics-based models. So you like that. Bayesian processing is based on PDF estimation using Bayes' rule. So this is the posterior distribution. The hat means estimate, and we're trying to find out the distribution of X. That's what we're after, our state or our signal, based on the data Y. Bayes' rule looks like this, where the posterior is created or can be decomposed into the likelihood times the prior divided by the evidence. The Bayesian approach extracts, once you've got this, you can extract statistics from the posterior. You can use that to solve a whole bunch of different problems. For example, once you've got the posterior distribution, the p hat here, then you could integrate it in a sense to pull out an estimate of the variable or the signal that you're interested in. Bayesian techniques use Bayes' rule. Again, we'd look at it. This is the posterior. This is called the likelihood because it's the data given the best information you have about the variable you're trying to estimate, the most likely. This is the transition prior, and this is called the evidence. It's really a normalization factor. In fact, in particle filters, you really kind of ignore that. And you just look, you use the likelihood and the prior. So this simple relationship is the principal foundation of Bayesian signal processing, both theoretically for derivations and pragmatically for implementations. You can manipulate Bayes' rule, divide, multiply, all that kind of thing, but it always boils down to this: decompose it, etc. And so that's kind of nice because it's at least confined that way. So Bayesian techniques can be thought of as converting the prior. This is the prior information that we have about the distribution. If we don't know anything, we usually just assume it's uniform. And so this is our prior. Notice it's wide. X are the random variables or random parameters, and this is the probability. And you can think of Bayesian techniques as converting this, getting more resolution, and attempting to compress this into various modes or peaks of the distribution. So the Bayesian approach to the signal processing problem represents an alternative. It's simulation-based. It's a simulation-based numerical approach because you have to generate the random samples. And it's been used for many years to solve complex mathematical problems that can't be solved otherwise. It's a powerful means for generating random samples used in estimating the posterior. It's a class of stochastic Monte Carlo computations to simulate the dynamics of a physical or mathematical system, capturing their inherent uncertainties. And it's really a set of Monte Carlo techniques that have recently evolved in the signal processing area. It's not recent anymore, but roughly around 2000, around that period of time. The Monte Carlo method provides the foundation for simulation-based Bayesian signal processing. So the method is a stochastic computational technique. It actually evolved in the mid-1940s. It was conceived by Fermi and Ulam with the advent of the first computer, the ENIAC computer. It was coined and developed by Metropolis, Ulam, and von Neumann in 1947. Wow, that's a long time ago. It's been applied in many, many areas: medicine, biology, chemistry, math, engineering. It solves problems in simulation, integration, optimization, inversion, and learning. Monte Carlo sampling, trying to give you a physical feel for what I mean. You can solve for posterior distributions by numerical integration, which is totally computationally intensive. Here's an example from Frankel, where they're trying to estimate the depth of the Nile River. And so you would put a grid around, in this case, they put it around all of the country, and then start doing the integrations to try to extract the posterior distribution. The Monte Carlo sampling technique is you have a surveyor, he's in the river, he's taking random samples as he walks through the river, depth samples, and is reporting them. So the difference is in the regions of importance, like the river, in this case for the depth, that's where these techniques will focus on, rather than attempting to do a full-up numerical integration to solve it. Just as a quick example, if we were to generate samples from a sampling distribution, this is just a Gaussian distribution, and you can't really tell much from this. But what we do is we then take the random samples, and we can estimate things like the histogram or the smooth histogram or the kernel density estimate. And so you can see this is an estimate of the Gaussian distribution from the samples themselves. I kind of look at this as like I can't tell anything from the samples, but if I go ahead and somehow come up with the distribution, then I can look at it. It gives me information that I'm interested in. I can extract that through inferences. So you view the samples are there, but you view, and the samples are the particles, and you'll view them through these different schemes to estimate the PDF. So Bayesian model-based processing techniques incorporate a priori knowledge of the phenomenology into the processing scheme to estimate the posterior distribution. And this can be anything. I've worked on problems in nuclear physics to a non-destructive evaluation, et cetera, acoustics, sonar. And so that's the phenomenology, whatever it is, the physics that's driving this. You have a measurement scheme, it can be an array or whatever, and you usually have background noise models of various things. So the model-based scheme allows you to incorporate all the a priori information you want. The only difference is instead of getting a signal directly, what you're getting is an estimate of the posterior distribution with the Bayesian approach. Once you have that posterior, then you basically have it all. You can extract and infer statistics from that. So the model-based approach to signal processing, this is just an example of the model-based approach. And consider it's a direction of arrival estimation where you have a plane wave impinging on an array. And so the plane wave model it's the mathematics of the plane wave could be incorporated into the processor. You could have an acoustic array with noise, and then basically that's how you construct the processor. So the classical approach is just an example with a two-element array and a time series. Classical approach is, in order to estimate the plane wave, we need to know the temporal frequency and the direction or the bearing that it's coming in. So one way to do it, in this simple example, is to just take the Fourier transform of the time series, look for the peak, and just pull off the peak value, and that gives you the value of the temporal frequency. The beamformer, it wouldn't be very accurate, but a two-element beamformer then is a spatial spectral estimator, and what it's trying to do is find out its peak where the bearing angle is. So that's kind of the classical approach. The model-based approach is different in the sense that it incorporates the model of the plane wave that you see here, and it also incorporates the model of the noise and the pressure field. And then basically it sequentially attempts at each point in time to come up with an estimate of the bearing. And you can see it's converged here and the temporal frequency. One of the nice properties of the model-based processes are that typically they create an error innovation or prediction error sequence, and that sequence can be exploited to tell you how well the processor is working. I have a good friend, practical statistician, and he explained to me that if your model has captured everything in the data, then basically there should be nothing left, and that's what that sequence should tell you. Just like if you ever fit, let's see, polynomials to data using least squares, you keep increasing the degree, and once you check the residual, the difference between what the polynomial predicts and what the measurement predicts, and you basically look at the residual sequence and see if the samples are uncorrelated. And that's called whiteness. If it's a white sequence, then it's an uncorrelated sequence, and therefore that tells you that you've removed the model. In this case, you've picked the proper degree to estimate that polynomial. So you've all done that before, I'm sure. Okay, so now we're going to talk about sequential Bayesian processing. And so again, the sequential techniques, they're Monte Carlo techniques now. They're obtained from sample-based representation, just like we did for the Gaussian data. If you have a real-time process, you're trying to do this in real time, or the data is non-stationary, the statistics vary as a function of time, then sequential methods have to be employed to solve that. You can't just take a batch of data and try to come up with it. A particle filter is a sequential Monte Carlo technique in which the underlying posterior distribution of interest is characterized by a set, or called a cloud, of random samples, and that's the particles. In a sense, a particle filter is a non-parametric representation of the posterior in discrete form, the probability mass function. And you can think of it as a sophisticated histogram or kernel density estimator if you want, but it will converge to the posterior distribution, and there's a bunch of theorems, et cetera, that demonstrate that. Particle filters represent the next generation of processors that are not constrained to linear models or Gaussian distributions. The Gaussians, all of the Kalman filtering type things evolved from Gaussian assumptions. So the posterior distribution can be estimated using the sequential Bayesian processor. It works like this. You have to look at the data. So you have the data, and that gives you an estimate. That's your initial guess. You have this weighting function, and that's called the Bayes operator. And so you start out with the initial guess, you multiply it by the weighting factor, and that brings you to the next stage. And then you go to the same thing. You update the weights, you go to the next stage. And so that's how the sequential processor works until you finally reach the posterior distribution at the end of the time. And this is the Bayes operator looks like this. There's our likelihood. This is called the state transition probability, or it takes the place of the prior. And of course, that's the evidence. So a particle filter is a sequential Monte Carlo technique in which the underlying posterior distribution of interest is characterized by a set or a cloud of samples, the particles. It's an algorithm that sequentially propagates and updates the random samples drawn from the previous stage, as I just explained to you in the block diagram, to obtain a set of samples approximately distributed from the next stage. Again, this is the form of it where we see the previous stage and the next stage, and it's the weighting function that basically gets calculated at each point. So a particle is a random sample. A swarm or a cloud of particles is a group of particles. A particle filter on input takes the data, and on output produces an estimate of the posterior distribution, which we then exploit through inference to pull out the statistics that we're interested in. The particles are the location parameters. They're the x-axis. Think of a histogram again. They're the x-axis of the plot. and they're the location parameters along with their associated weights that gather in the highest regions of probability. So this is actually the output of a particle filter of the population growth problem that I gave you on the web. There's posted a view graph presentation that describes this in detail, and then a set of MATLAB codes that you can run that will generate the particle filter outputs. But once you have these particles, then the posterior distribution, as I said before, can be observed through the probability mass estimation, in this case, a histogram or kernel density. I think this is a kernel density that I fit to these particles. So that's sort of the idea, is that you're generating these particles, you're weighting them, and that gives you an estimate of the posterior distribution. Here's another example, the same problem, population problem. You get the swarm of particles. Then you basically can see them in a sense by fitting a kernel density. You don't have to do the kernel density, just help me visualize what these look like. And then each point, notice a couple things about the output of the particle filter. First, it's non-uniformly spaced. These aren't equally spaced samples, okay? Second, you can think about this as like a probability associated with that particular location. So for example, the mean or the mode of this distribution is up at this peak. And if you look at that, that gives you its probability versus its location. Same thing along here. So you can see that what the particle filters actually do is they attempt to coalesce particles in regions of highest probability. Now notice another thing, this is just one sample in time. So if you think of a time series, this is what makes it different from the standard signal processing that we're used to, where we're given a set of data and we build a filter in some part of the frequency domain to eliminate or to enhance the signal. In this case, this is just one time sample, or this can be a vector if it's a multi-channel system. So the particle filter at this point in time has estimated an empirical distribution. So it's a probability mass function, and the W's can be thought of as probabilities. So think of it that way. But we don't have that. We have a whole bunch of time steps in a time series, and that's what we're seeing here. So the particle filter at each point in time is estimating the associated posterior probability. So if I have 10 samples, I've got 10 distributions. And so that now you can understand why it's so computationally intensive, because at each point you're estimating the posterior distribution, and you control how many particles to use in fact, that's the primary knob in a particle filter, is how many particles will I use? Engineers use less than 1,000. Statisticians use 20 to 50,000, just to give you an idea. And so the computations go up, of course, as you increase the number of particles. So here's an example where if I take now these posterior at each point in time, and I take the maximum value of the posterior distribution, and then go back and find the location, the little red dot, the location parameter, this is an estimate of the maximum a posteriori, that's where the name comes from, estimate of, in this case, X. And in fact, if I then take these X's and plot them, this is what like a Kalman filter might give you. It would give you an estimate of the time series. Well, you're getting an estimate of the time series, but you're doing it by estimating the posterior distribution at every point in time. And if it's a vector, then you've got n of these for each state or parameter. So you have to keep that in mind. I call this a loaf of bread, and these are the slices in the bread, and each slice is an estimate of the posterior distribution that the particle filter is performing. So the particle filters this is again the population problem, but you can see there's multiple peaks. So you can't do a Kalman filter. If you did a Kalman filter, it would just probably locate the single peak and basically center its information there. But these are slices as I walk along the loaf of bread's going up this way. And as I walk along that, you can see I get posterior distributions. In this case, I've got 5 modes. In this case, I've got 2. In this case, I've got 2, possibly 3. So they're very, very powerful because, first of all, they're not Gaussian. Gaussian only assumes there's a single mode, and they can handle nonlinear processes as well. So particle filters have applicability in many different areas. In signal processing, image processing, model selection, tracking and navigation, communications, wireless networks, channel estimation in speech, and applications in the sciences, genomics, geosciences, seismology, medicine, etc. Even psychiatry and social sciences. There's advantages and disadvantages. The advantage of the particle filter is the ability to represent arbitrary densities. I just showed you that for a population growth problem. They can adaptively focus on highly probable regions. So when I talk a little bit about the particular particle filter, you'll see that it attempts to obtain the particles in the regions of highest probability, which is the peaks of the distributions. It can handle multimodal and non-Gaussian noise, and it also allows you to use multiple models. The disadvantage, obviously, is high computations, because at every point in time, instead of getting an estimate of X, we're getting its posterior distribution, and then we can infer the statistics about X. It's difficult to determine the optimal number of particles to use. You guess and try it. The number of particles increase with increasing model dimensions. So you can see if I use 100 particles, now I have 10 states, I've got 1,000. So it multiplies very rapidly. The potential problems are the degeneracy and loss of diversity in the particles. You kind of lose their effect. And the choice of proposal density is really, if you go look in the literature about particle filters, then each differs primarily by whatever they picked as the proposal distribution, the Q, so to say. So for state space processors, now why state space? Well, state space is an extremely versatile mathematical representation. Basically, Kalman's major contribution, even though we talk about the filter and it's got over 1 million references, there are certain properties of the state space, like observability, controllability, etc. And that's what Kalman focused his research on back in after the filter in 1960. He moved into the state space, and it's extremely flexible, because you can represent, in the old days of analog computers, you have many systems that are analogous to one another: mechanical, electrical, chemical, fluid, etc. So it's a very versatile framework to operate in, and it easily handles multi-channel processes. That's one of the big, sort of, to me, the downfalls of signal processing. Even multi-channel spectral estimation is limited, in signal processing, where the state space. I have a recent paper I just put out in Acoustical Society for multi-channel, trying to explain to people how you can estimate multi-channel processors using state space techniques. So it's a powerful framework to work on. So the definitions is, we have the state variables. These can be vectors, and the measurement vector. And these can be, they can be functions of past states, inputs, and noises. And the major thing, remember, we're trying to get the Bayes operator, so we need the transition probability, and I like to write it with the A because it's a function of the state space model, and the likelihood, the C, which is the measurement part of the state space model. So the Bayesian approach to state space looks like this: is the famous in statistics, the Chapman-Kolmogorov equation. I'm not going to derive it, but I do have it within my textbook. But anyway, it's a way to go from the state at time t-1 through the state space or the transition probability by integration, and that will get you to the next value of the state at time t. And the same thing happens with the likelihood. Once you've got this predicted probability here, once you've got that, then you can progress by using the likelihood probability or this measurement model in the state space to get to the posterior distribution. So state space processors rely on sequential importance sampling, and this Q is called the importance distribution. And in state space, we have the transition, as I just said, the transition probability. I like to use a script A to remind me that that's where the state space model goes, and the script C to tell me that's the likelihood, and that's where the measurement model goes. So assuming this, the state space particle filter kind of looks like this. You draw a sample, the state, you draw it from this importance distribution. You then can calculate, you have the models for the measurements and the states, and you can then propagate them with this to get the Bayes factor. You normalize that, and you can use that then to estimate your posterior distribution. There's a theorem that states that as the number of particles get large in a limit, this distribution will converge to the true posterior. So that's sort of the powerful mathematics that was behind these techniques. The important thing to realize is when you design these, what you're designing, you're selecting what that importance distribution is, what Q is. And each of the different particle filters basically are doing that. They're picking a different distribution prior for Q. The generic state space looks like what I just showed you. You can initialize it, the state transition probability, and you basically, as I showed you in the beginning, if you pick random samples, in this case it could be Gaussian, you pick that from the distribution, then you run it through the state space model. And then once you have this, you basically have this, and then you run, you can get the likelihood is calculated based on the measurement equation, and the sample you just generated, which then leads to the state particles, then gets imported into the likelihood. And then you can calculate the weights, and then that will lead you to the empirical posterior distribution. So the importance distributions provide the key. And in this case, in 1993, Neil Gordon really was the guy that made these things practical, in my opinion. That, and of course, computational horsepower that evolved certainly during that period. What Neil did was he said, oh, let me pick for the prior the transition, the state transition probability. So if you go into the expression for the weights, if he picks this, then these cancel, and therefore the weighting function is just simply the likelihood. So you generate, you take process noise, you run it through the state model, you get the state variable, and then it gets input to the likelihood function. And this is called the bootstrap estimator, and that's the one I'll show you that I applied. Most people use this. It's not the greatest, but it certainly seems to work reasonably well. It seems to be robust enough to work on lots of different problems. And the MATLAB codes I gave you are implementing the bootstrap estimator. So it kind of looks like this. If you look at even a Kalman filter structure, you go through a prediction step. This is the particle filter using the state space model. The data comes in, you go through the update step, and then we have this other little tiny box that creates a problem. It's called resampling, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. You have to resample the particles, recalculate the weights, and now go back up and do the next sample. So if you do this, let's see, someone's got their mic on. It's interfering a bit. Mute yourself if you don't mind. Okay, so you can see how the probability, the conditional probability evolves as the particle filter updates its phases. Now, here's the big problem. Particles deplete in number. It's called degeneration. And if you were to just let the particle filter that I just showed you in the flow diagram run without doing resampling, then all of the particles you pick will collapse to a single particle. And that's primarily because the variance in the estimates in each step increases. So that's what Gordon said back in '93. He said the particles have to be rejuvenated or equivalently resampled. This is something that you'll have to think about a little bit. In fact, I have a view graph that's in my backups that goes through a simple example to motivate it, but you'll see it once you go through it. It's like one of those things, but it's not an obvious. So resampling inhibits the depletion problem, but increases the uncertainty. So you have to resample, but you'll increase the variance when you do so. If it's not implemented properly, it can increase the computational time enormously. And it's a process that attempts to preserve the particles with large weights. So if a particle has a large weight, that means it's high probability. Okay, whereas if it has a small weight, it's a small probability. So you're trying to get rid of the small weights and keep the large weights. So if you look at it this way, if you do importance sampling and you have highest probability regions, you might wind up with these large weights and these tiny weights. And so what you do is resampling will basically break the large weights into a multiple number of the uniform weights, in a sense you can think of it, and delete these weak probabilities. Just gives you sort of a visual of what I'm talking about. So if you start out and you have a probability distribution, and these are the weights that are used to, again, we're looking at it through a kernel density estimator, so to say. So you can see these are the weights, these are the high probabilities, we're just sideways. And so this is the probability. Now, if I go through the update step, well, now I get these large probability weights, and these are the small ones. And now I do the resampling into these numbers of weights to represent each one. Then you can see we've deleted the weak probabilities and we've progressed to the next level. And you can see that what's happening is we're starting to form the region of high probability, which then follows when I go through the next step, et cetera. So that's what's going on as you progress through the particles. So the bootstrap algorithm, again, looks like this. You go through the update stage where you, in our case, you would generate it with, let's say, noise. It runs through the state space model that generates the particle, and bootstrap only is estimating the likelihood. So we plug this particle into the likelihood function, calculate it, and then we've got the weights, because the weight for the bootstrap is just simply the likelihood. And then once we've got the weights, then we've got the empirical distribution of the posterior as we walk through each of the slices in Brett. Now, how do you know if a particle filter is working? Well, that's a good question. Excuse me. Well, For Kalman filters, we know that, at least for the linear Kalman filter, that it's optimal if its residual sequence is 0, meaning white. So we can perform statistical tests on the innovation sequence. And this is what I was talking about before with fitting the polynomials, etc. That if the model is matching the data, then all you see is an uncorrelated sequence, a white sequence, and everything has been removed by the model, all the correlations. So in a sense, the model's fitting the data. Well, that's what the Kalman filters do. And people do that for both the linear and nonlinear filters. And it tells you that the model is fitting the data and it's valid. So for the particle filters, first of all, even for nonlinear Kalman filters, you must run ensembles. You generate it, then you pick a new random set of initial conditions and run it again, etc. And then you can get ensemble statistics, which is really the only way to do these, to do the nonlinear problems. Linear is straightforward. I should mention too that the Kalman filter is a Bayesian processor, because we know we can prove that. But two, it's sort of backwards in the sense that it's already assumed that the posterior distribution is known, that it's multi-channel Gaussian. And so that you can think of the Kalman filter as Bayesian, but we already know what the posterior distribution is. It's a multi-channel Gaussian distribution. And so the Kalman filter, in my mind, is an efficient way of sequentially or recursively calculating the posterior conditional mean and the posterior conditional variance. So it is a filter, but that's why it's much easier than having to do all of these resamples and use particles to estimate the posterior, because you already know what the posterior is. You've assumed it. And it's unimodal Gaussian. And so anyway, I throw that in since I was there. Okay, so another way to, one way to evaluate the performance of a particle filter is to use what's called the Kullback-Leibler information quantity. And it looks like this. This is the calculation. It comes from information theory. And it basically takes the true distribution that you know, we don't know it, but we're assuming we know it, and you take what the particle filter estimates, and you calculate this information quantity. And one of the properties is if the true posterior distribution is close to the estimated one, then this should be 0. The Kullback-Leibler should be 0. The only problem with this is that the Kullback-Leibler is not a distance metric. So mathematically, this isn't, you can have lots of problems with that, whereas you can make it into a distance metric by this calculation. You just flip the true with the estimate and then the estimate with the true. This is a distance metric, and it's called the Kullback-Leibler divergence metric. So that's one of the things that we basically use to determine that once we can figure out how to get the true distribution. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, if you know the true distribution, then why do you have to build any of this stuff? Well, the answer is you don't necessarily know it, but you may have a finite element model with 100,000 states or something in it, and you can generate data from that using histograms, et cetera, to come up with some guess at what the distribution is. So the Kullback-Leibler divergence provides a reasonable metric for both the state and the measurement particle filters. So we have the true and we have the estimate, and this is what it looks like if you look over an ensemble. In this case, it's just a single, but you can see the green is what the true distribution is, and the red is what we've estimated with our particle filter, and then this is the value of the Kullback-Leibler divergence. So you have states and measurements. So for the states, it's small, and for the measurements, it's small, but what does small mean? That's what always drove me nuts. I don't know if that's small. It depends on the scales of your data. So there's another metric. Oh, I'm sorry. So that's, there's another metric called the Hellinger metric. And a friend of mine, Grace Clark, introduced me to this idea. What's nice about this is small is defined. The Hellinger metric is a metric. It evolves from nonlinear mathematics, so it doesn't have this information theory motivation, but it works well, and it's between 0 and 1. So now we have a feel for if it's 1, it's no good. The model, you didn't do a good job. If it's 0 or close to it or small, then you have done a good job. Now remember, this is based on a posterior distribution. So what happens is, as you go over an ensemble of data, you have to do this for a run for each one of these, and you get at time t, the final time, you get the posterior distribution. Then you run it again, and you generate an ensemble. In this case, I generated 100 of them, and then this is for the measurements, and this is for the states. This is Kublak-Leibler. And this is the Hellinger distances. And so you can take like the average or the median or the average values of these things, and it gives you at least a feel overall how you're doing. And for each particular realization, that tells you what the metric is. Okay, so that brings us to the final part of the presentation, which is now, let's try to build one of these things in the ocean. And so, first of all, the ocean is varying as temperature, the shallow ocean is a varying medium. So in this case, it's dispersive, and it's really caused by the changes in the temperature. So if you're up at the shallow ocean, let's say 100 meters or less, then you're subject to temperature variations, which is reflected by the sound speed profile. Okay, so the Bayesian technique, we talked about this already, except now we're going to focus it on the ocean. And the idea with the Bayesian approach is we get some model of the ocean one way or the other. In this case, it's going to be a normal mode model of the ocean. We have an array. And in this case, for me, it was a vertical array of sensors. And we have a measurement model. And then we also have noise and uncertainty, which you can model that either by doing background noise measurements while you're aboard ship, or you can guess at it or assume it's Gaussian. That's the other thing you can do. So when the statistics are non-stationary, then sequential Monte Carlo methods must be employed to solve the problem. Again, so we have the data, and then the output is the posterior. Can you mute your microphone? You're cutting in. Okay, so for a normal mode model, I can't go through all this, but this is Clay and Medwin, and so you can start out with the Helmholtz partial differential equation, perform separation of variables, and approximate the range with the Hankel function, and you get a set of ordinary differential equations in depth, and they look like this, where M is the mode index. How many modes do you have? And this is what the dispersion relationship looks like as a function of the modes. And we've assumed a Hankel solution for the range. The pressure field measurement is nonlinear. This is the modal functions, and beta is the modal coefficient. Here's the Hankel function. I'm not going to go into all that stuff, but it just gives you can basically use this as part of your model. So this would be the measurement model, and the previous one would be the state model. I gave you a copy of the paper that goes into details on all of this. That's the JAZA paper on environmentally adaptive, whatever. So once the ODEs are discretized I use central differences. and we're trying to estimate the modal coefficient, the beta. We call that a parameter theta. And so at each mode, it's a function of each mode, as I said before. So you get the modal function, which are the state equations. This is process noise terms. And this is now a random walk model of the modal coefficient. So the way this works is as we walk down the array, remember we're sequential, so as we walk in depth along the array, Z is the depth. As we walk in depth, then we update the estimates of the modes, and then we estimate the estimates of the modal coefficients. So it's handling a non-stationary process that's time varying, if you want to think of it, or depth varying, because the modal coefficients are changing. So the basic problem is this adaptive problem. I use the only one I have from 1988. I still have that data. It's from Bill Carey, who did the Hudson Canyon experiment. And it looked like this. You had a vertical array of 23 sensors. This was the source depth. This is the sound speed. And they put a source at 36 meters away and excited the ocean, so to say. Flat bottom, this gives you all the details of the model that was used. And they made measurements. They ran an experiment based on this. So what we're trying to do is, given this noisy pressure field measurement, find the best estimates of the modal functions, one, and also the modal coefficients, the betas and the phis, and enhance the pressure field. So the particle filter design, this is the stages where you pick the number of particle filters, et cetera, generate an ensemble. First of all, for the normal mode model, there are boundary value problems that you guys who do ocean acoustic modeling run. Kraken, Snap, just a bunch of them. And that gives us the initial parameters for the state space propagator to get it started. And then we basically use this. This gets built into the particle filter. And then we generate an ensemble, as I just said, do Kublek-Leibler, et cetera. And that's the performance analysis. So, and the primary knob in this is either your models, you can change the models, or it can be the number of particles. It's just, in a sense, that simple. And if you're an ocean modeler, then you should be happy, because there's no fancy Riccati equations like a Kalman filter. You just use the model that you're using, that you're believing, and you can build the particle filter right around it. Drive that model with noise that generates the state particles, and then feed that into the likelihood for the bootstrap. And the likelihood function is derived based on whatever you think the measurement noise process is. So the outputs of the particle filter can be used for localization, enhancement, and inversion. These are multiple problems. Again, we had the inputs from in Hudson Canyon. Everybody and his brother ran Kraken and Snap and all those models. So I had some pretty good guesses at what the parameters should be. And that gets incorporated into the states then those parameters, and then you get the states, the measurement, and the noise models. And then we take the actual measurements and build it into the processor. So particle filtering, this is what the particle filter looks like. Remember, it's trying to get the probability mass function. So, and the weights are based on the likelihood and the state transition mechanisms. And then once we have this estimate of the posterior distribution, we can infer the statistics from it. One, of course, is the maximum a posteriori. That was my loaf of bread, where I showed you where we picked the peaks and it located the values. Using Bootstrap, this is the Bootstrap estimator, except now it's in terms of the problem, which are the modal functions and the weight and the unknown parameters. And so then we do go through the same steps. We use the likelihood probability. In this case, I think I assumed it was Gaussian. normalize the weights, resample, now you know what those things are, and then estimate the posterior distribution. Then we can get the map estimate from the loaf of bread, or you can just take and sum over the weights, and that'll give you the mean squared error, minimum mean squared error, or conditional mean estimate. So it's pretty powerful once you've got that. So the results, see, I still have 9 minutes. So again, this is the experiment that Bill Carey ran, and he ran another set in the 90s, but this is the only data that I had. So you had a 23-element array. The source was 50 hertz, set a depth of 36 meters. It supported 5 modes. That came from the boundary value solution, so I knew that. We assumed Gaussian noise. And the length of the particle filter, I picked 1,000 particles. So this is predicting the pressure field. So the data are these blue dots. That's the pressure as we're going down in depth. And you can see there was some problem as they got lower. We had some uncertainties in the estimates. The particle filter produced a posterior distribution at each depth, and then we estimated the map. We selected those values. So this is the map estimate, and this is the conditional mean estimate. If you look at the pressure field distribution, it looks unimodal, which is pretty cool. So I also ran on this, I don't see it, it looks like it's buried somewhere. I also ran what's called an unscented Kalman filter. It's a nonlinear Kalman filter. It's very good. That's the one you want to use. Forget extended Kalman filters. Use the unscented filter. And it's, it's in my book and all that kind of stuff. But the bottom line is that it's a powerful technique, but it's only good for unimodal distributions. So that's where, unless you wanted to do what's called mixtures, and that's a different story. But anyway, so this looks pretty unimodal. So probably did a good job on that. Now we go to the modal functions and the particle filters. So let's see. So the data is the blue line. The map estimate is, and the conditional means are the magenta and the red lines, and then the unscented filter is the turquoise one. So you can see, I don't think the unscented filter does that bad, but we'll find out in a minute. You can see here, as the modes get higher, it starts to do worse and worse. This is what I picked 2 of the modes. This is mode number 1, and you can see it's clearly multimodal, but then it starts, as it goes down further in depth, it starts to get more like it's unimodal. Again, multiple peaks, so the unscented filter isn't going to do very well at these depths, but as we get towards the end, it looks like it's doing better. This wasn't a good picture, but this is how the particles coalesced for these different distributions, mode 1, mode 2, and mode 3. It's where the particle filter placed its particles. So it tries to, you can see it's very dense in that region. Then these are the mode errors. So if I took the model, no noise on it, and compared it to what the particle filter estimated, then these are the tracking errors. So they're pretty small. So the adaptivity is the beta coefficient. That's the modal coefficient itself, and that's varying. So we try. This is what I call a parametrically adaptive processor, because it's adjusting the beta coefficient at each point in time. And so if I held it constant, which is what most of the people that do match field processing, they use it, and it's pretty much constant. That's what it looks like, whereas the adaptive one moved around. Whoops, sorry. The adaptive one moved around and adapted to the different depths, and this is again caused by the dispersion relationship, things like that. Okay, so that's really the application of the particle filter. Again, all the details are in the JASA paper that you have available to you. And the main purpose of the talk is really to try to give you an overview of Bayesian type signal processing. Now I'll advertise my stuff. So this is the second edition book. You notice these beautiful covers. That's my wife is an artist, and so that's snippets of her paintings. This one was me. That's just a spectrogram. So this is a new book on model-based processing, and it's using subspace. So here I'm trying to fit the state space models to data, and the application was really vibrational responses I was interested in. So these algorithms are available in MATLAB. That's nice. If you have the identification toolbox, it does the N4SID algorithm, which is a sort of the workhorse in my mind. So basically, we're doing 4 minutes spare here. So we presented an overview of Bayesian signal processing evolving into the design of a particle filter, which is a sequential Monte Carlo technique. We developed a solution to the mode tracking problem and compared it to the unscented Kalman filter. We demonstrated that the bootstrap particle filter on a pressure field from Hudson Canyon, we demonstrated its performance on that data set. And we've shown that the particle filter performance for this case is quite reasonable. So that's it. Thank you for your attention. And I hope at least you realize that Bayesian processing, the major thing to take away from it is that it's focused on estimating the posterior distribution. It uses Monte Carlo sampling techniques, so it's a simulation-based processor that's generating these particles, okay? It uses your favorite physics models that you have of whatever the problem is you're working on, so you don't have to do any more. If you've simulated your physics, then add noise to it, and you can generate particles to your heart's content, and then calculate the Bayesian weights. So that's about it.